Jewish Insights with Justin Pines on JBS is made possible in part by the clubs at Pearl River, New York, luxury rental communities for ages 55 and better, now leasing Phase 3 at the Reserve, and the B.L. Manger Foundation.
Shalom and welcome to Jewish Insights. I'm excited today to be doing part 4 of our series on Purim this year. As you all know by now, I'm very focused on the Jewish calendar leading us to ask questions of the moment. And so we had Dr. Ilana Stein-Hain talk to us about what it's like to be an American Jew living in Israel, the question of diaspora that comes out of Purim. We had the comedian Modi come and chat with us about humor and Jewish humor. And we had Dr. Rachel Fish in honor of Parshat Zachor when we remember Amalek and we think about what does it mean to face evil straight in the eye and how do we think about anti-Semitism. And today we're going to, let's call it the Holy of Holies. We're going deep to the center of Purim, which is the story of Esther, megillah Esther, the story of Esther. At first glance, as you might imagine, some of us have maybe read the Megillah before, maybe we remember it as a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, maybe we kind of painfully sit through it at the end of our fast, the night of Purim, and just want to get to the end. But this is why we return. This is why we come back to read these texts each year to find new meaning. In fact, when I asked my guest today to interview him about the book that he wrote on Megillat Esther over 10 years ago, his response was that he would be happy to do that, but that he's actually continued to do much work on the Megillah since then, which is just this amazing reminder that we have an obligation not only to know our Torah, our text, but also to come back to it each year, to revisit it, to find new ways to access that text. And so my guest today is Rabbi David Fohrman, founder and lead scholar at Aleph Beta. Over the last 2 decades, he's pioneered a way of reading biblical text that feels both rigorous and revelatory. I'll say that for me, what really stands out are 3 things about the way he approaches Torah. The first is his focus on the big picture, right? Really trying to tie together the broad spectrum of what is Torah and finding themes that are across that big picture. The second is the way he looks at narrative. I'm a person who grew up watching movies at home and was very focused on understanding narrative and the way he takes the stories of Torah and helps us understand them in a deeper way. And third, perhaps most important, is that he doesn't stop there. He really focuses on the meaning. And as a Musar student, for me, if you sit with a text, the goal is to come away from that text with a sense of meaning, with where you're going to be, how you're going to be different after reading that text. And anytime you learn any of his Torah, he's drawing meaning about how we should be differently after that. Through Aleph Beta, he's given expression to all these ideas, developing what is now a vast library of content spanning all types of media. Animated videos, which are very popular and you've probably seen before, his podcast, a book like no other, books like the one we'll mention today, as well as many, many others. One of those books is this book, The Queen You Thought You Knew, Unmasking Esther's Hidden Story, which I highly recommend. And he's also embarked on an effort to train a team of Torah scholars adept at the close reading methodology he's pioneered, which I hope we'll come to understand today in detail. And though this is our first time meeting, I have been influenced by his Torah in countless ways as well as by his students. I'll just share one example. I think it was this year, High Holidays, I was in Congregation Eitz Chaim in Livingston with Rabbi Klebanoff, and Rabbi David Block was the guest, Baal Tefillah, the leader of prayers there that weekend, and also shared Divrei Torah, words of Torah. And I was asked to give a class there, and one of the classes I gave, I talked about the idea of Shabbat, and I said that this is an idea from Rabbi Reuven Leichter, who I learned from online, who talks about the idea that Shabbat is a time where we learn from Hashem's resting. Hashem didn't rest on the Sabbath because Hashem needed a break, because Hashem doesn't need a break, but Hashem reminded us that we have a moment, a fleeting moment, where everything is actually in its right place. Everything's perfect, and we should delight in that for a day before we go back to work the next day. And I shared that, and Rabbi Block came up to me afterwards, and he shared the following Torah from Rabbi Fohrman, which has stuck with me since. And he said, what you shared was beautiful, but Rabbi Fohrman taught me, and I hope I'm not misquoting, and if I am, you'll let me know, this idea that Hashem also, at the end of the sixth day, Hashem had created man and woman, had created people, and then on the seventh day, Hashem had a moment to delight in enjoying Hashem's creations, God's creations. And then the same way we try to copy God in all of our life, on the Sabbath is a moment where we work so hard all week, we have a moment to slow down and delight in our children, in our family, to appreciate them for who they are. It's not a day about fixing or improving or getting through the week. It's a day about appreciating and delighting in them. And I think about that all the time ever since, so thank you for that. Rabbi Fohrman, among many things, I continue to learn from you. I'm super excited to learn from you. I've been waiting through this for a long time. Welcome to the show, and let's jump in.
Okay, thank you for having me, and it's great to be here. And nice to hear about your connection to David Block, actually an employee of ours before he went off to head Shalhevet in Los Angeles.
Exactly. Great. So you're an interesting person in that, like, people know your name. Like, there aren't that many people that, like, in the Torah ways, they're like, it's like you know, there are the greats of Torah scholarship. I feel like people, like, refer to your Torah and refer to Aleph Beta, and it's a very powerful, it stands out as different than what's going on out there. Before we get into that, and I don't want to embarrass you, I apologize, share a little bit about yourself and how you arrived on this path, right? Where you, how did you get into Torah in this way? How did you get into Torah in this type of methodology?
I guess it's a good question. To some extent, it might have to do with straddling worlds and not feeling entirely comfortable in any one of them.
I can relate.
Right. Somehow, when you grow up in a single system and are just kind of part of it, it's all too easy to adopt the unconscious ways that system sees things and not be willing to look outside of that. So I made a move right around a really formative point in life, early teenagerhood. I grew up in California when I was young. My father was a psychiatrist. We were in Northern California. My father, Olav Shalom, died when I was young. My mom remarried. We came to the East Coast. And in California, I had access to a very special man, Rabbi Yosef Leibowitz. I was very young. I was just 8, 9, and 10. But I was one of those kids who didn't go out for the sermon, right? And who stuck around and listened. And there was something captivating about what he was doing with text. And he was the first guy who kind of turned me on to this notion that the text of the Torah itself is something very special. The podcast, which you just mentioned that we have, is called A Book Like No Other. And that's kind of been my motto ever since, that there's something about the book which is just stand out and amazing. You can talk around the book. You can try to prove that God exists and do all sorts of things there, or you can just read the book. And sometimes you just read the book itself just sort of opens up flowers before your eyes. And my first example of that, I think, was listening to him. When I came to New York, when I came to the East Coast, everything felt very different. I went to Yeshiva High School, and suddenly no one learned the Bible anymore. It was the strangest of things. Right. We learned the Talmud and engrossed ourselves in that. And it seemed like no one was kind of taking Bible seriously. There was, you said a little something here or there during Shalosh Shittas, something, but it wasn't, and I couldn't figure out why. Like, why isn't anyone, like, if you believe that God wrote this book, so wouldn't you think that God has something to say in it and something really profound to say in it? And then, I remember being frustrated with that and being in yeshiva and kind of sitting on the lawn during a break and opening a book of Exodus and thinking, like, I should be able to open this and it should be speaking to me in some profound, overarching way. And I was just frustrated because I couldn't do it. I couldn't figure out how to make that magic happen. And then over time, things kind of came together. One thing came together, and I started adapting some of the tools that I saw my teachers doing, both rabbis and secular teachers, just in terms of what they were doing in literature. And I found that when you applied it to the Bible, each one of these tools were powerful, and they synergized. And when you brought them together, they were really powerful. Basically, things kind of came together. I'll tell you a quick story where
Please.
I was in my early 20s, I suppose, and there was a bookstore in Baltimore called Bibelo. It was back in the age before Amazon, before when bookstores were still kind of cultural centers almost.
Okay.
And so Bibelo had this thing. They had like speakers who would come and do events, and authors who. So it turns out that this was the time where Bill Moyers had just filmed Genesis, A Living Conversation, which was a discussion group essentially on the Bible, which kind of made it kosher again for intellectually minded Jews to look at the Bible seriously and say there might be something here to learn. So Bibelo was very excited about Bill Moyers' new show, and they figured that they were going to do their own Bill Moyers style conversation, that the night before Moyers was going to air an episode on whatever it was he was going to air, they were going to take those same ideas, that same text, and invite a panel of people to come into the store to discuss it. So I was hanging around Bibelo one day. I used to hang around the Judaica section there, and there was a lady who ran the Judaica section for the store who kind of knew me just because I would hang out there. And she said, hey, we're doing this thing, and maybe you want to be one of these panelists to discuss this thing. So I was like, sure, I'm happy to do that. And I promptly kind of forgot about it, put it on my calendar. And then 2 months later, I get a call from the store. And they're like, okay, just reminding you that Thursday, you're part of this panel, and you're speaking on this Bill Moyers thing. And I was like, yeah, I forgot about that. Just tell me, what's the topic again? What are we talking about? So we're talking about Jacob's deception of Isaac and Esau. Oh, really? Okay, and who else is going to be there? Well, we had a hard time finding people. It's just going to be you and the chairman of the Department of Philosophy from the College of Notre Dame. And I'm thinking, okay, so I'm going to be the sacrificial rabbi, right? Dealing with this text that has probably given rise to more anti-Semitism over the years than any other.
Right.
And it's like, what am I going to say? What am I going to do? And it was then that I realized that sort of nothing I had learned in yeshiva had even remotely prepared me for anything that I was about to do.
And just to clarify, sorry, yeshiva then, there was Ner Yisrael. That's where you
I was in Ner Yisrael in Baltimore at the time.
Just say one sentence for our viewers who don't know what Ner Yisrael is.
Ner Yisrael is the great yeshiva in Baltimore at Ner Yisrael Rabbinical College. I was there at the time, and it was a fantastic place to be, but we didn't get this kind of training.
Right. Some of the brightest and greatest minds come out of there, but the focus is on Talmud studies and law, I assume, more than it is on Tanach, let's say.
Yeah, it wasn't really this. And that was really the moment that kind of galvanized this. I kind of figured the only thing I could possibly do is really go back to the text and make an argument, right? You can't just say, well, here's this medieval commentator and says that Esau was this really bad guy, so whatever Jacob did was justified. There must be something hiding under the text here. And it was kind of a little bit of a detective story to try to see what that might be. So I spent some time working on it. I came up with a theory. It was just the beginnings of a theory. But I figured, you know what? I'm going to call up this guy, the chair of the Department of Philosophy at College of Notre Dame. I actually knew him because I had taken some courses at Johns Hopkins under him. Wow. So I called him up and it's like, hi, you remember me? I'm your student. I was in these classes. I'm speaking with you at Bibelo. And it's like, can I take you out to dinner at the kosher restaurant, the night before? Let's talk about what we're going to do.
Yeah.
And so I basically just kind of laid my cards on the table and said, here's the theory that I want to suggest. And I went through it with him. And at the end of it, he was like, that's great. Why don't we can just do that together. We can co-present it. And that's what we did. We kind of co-presented it. And everyone loved it. There was 150 people there. And Bibelo was like, hey, can you guys come back next month and do that again? And this became kind of an Arabian Night sort of thing. Every month we would go and prepare something. And that kind of started me off on this kind of journey of into a book like no other, so to speak.
Beautiful. And I just want to reflect back what I heard and also, add a little bit more, if you can, which is I think you're saying in there, some of the seeds that were planted in there was a sense of, first of all, seeing it as a book, using literary analysis skills to try to understand what's happening when we look at a story from our tradition. And I hear you also saying, kind of depending on the commentators who came later, giving you a background it's not the same as trying to find what you're looking for in the text itself. There's a value in looking at the words as they are and trying to find. Does that make sense? And then if you were to just add a little bit more, if you were to start describing on one foot, let's say, what is your unique approach to Torah, what you're trying to do when you sit down and open up a Tanach, a Jewish book of Torah, what you're trying to do, and what tools you're using, how would you describe that?
So, yes, let me take the second and third parts of your formulation. So, first of all, yes, it's this notion that you can look at the text and it's going to speak to you. And that itself, in a way, is strangely revolutionary. It shouldn't be revolutionary, but it kind of is. Mm-hmm. If you're the beneficiary of a sort of traditional Jewish education, one of the things you know is that there's a lot of commentators on this book. This is the most commentated on book. Mm-hmm. So if you're teaching 8th grade Bible or 12th grade Bible or something in high school or in middle school, what are you going to teach? Mm-hmm. The temptation for a lot of teachers is to load up on commentary, right? And to teach, the same way that you can have an advanced course in Shakespeare. What are you going to do? You're going to go to all the literary criticism on Shakespeare and kind of read it all through. Mm-hmm. That's what we tend to do to the extent that we do learn Bible seriously. We almost don't learn Bible, we learn medieval commentators on the Bible, right? And what happens is the sort of nonverbal message that I give you as a teacher, if you're my student, can be kind of disempowering. Like, your brain is not really sophisticated enough to get anything out of this text, but maybe you have a chance of understanding what this super commentary said, or what this super commentary on that super commentary said. And if you can understand that, then maybe you have a way in. So you have a long line of people with very long beards be standing between you and this text, and you're thinking, who am I? I'm Justin, I'm David, I'm living 2,000 years after this is written, and I feel very disconnected from this text, I feel very disempowered, and maybe I can understand what someone said about what someone said about what someone said about this. And what I'm arguing is that's great, that there is a level of Torah learning where that's the thing that you do. But the same way that if you were learning Shakespeare, you couldn't possibly hope to understand those literary critics before really delving into the book itself, right? We shouldn't be intimidated to do that with the Bible. Like, no matter who you are, no matter what your background is, God wrote this for you. And if you just do a couple things, you should be able to get something out of it. And some of those things, counterintuitively, are actually forgetting everything you thought you knew about this book. One of the things I talk about in the introduction to The Beast That Crouches at the Door, which is the first book I read, is that, paradoxically, one of the problems that we have...
And that's about Cain and Abel and...
Adam and Eve.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
great.
right.
Yeah.
Yep. And what I said there is that, I talked about something which I call the lullaby effect. Is that paradoxically one of the problems we have when we read the Bible is that we know the stories really well. There's Adam and Eve shampoo, there's Adam and Eve apple juice, there's everything Adam and Eve, and everyone just knows the Adam and Eve story. But the problem is that if you know a story too well, right, then you fail to really be able to approach it with fresh eyes and see the questions that are right there. Like, think about things that you know really well. They almost become like tunes, like lullabies that lull you to sleep, and you don't see what's really there. Think about your average lullaby, Rockabye Baby, on the treetop, and imagine you've never heard the words before. Yeah. You're a kid, you're 3 years old, 4 years old, and your mother's singing this to you, and you're actually listening to the words. So, Rockabye Baby on the treetop, when the wind blows, that cradle's going to rock, but when the bough breaks, the cradle's going to fall, and down will come baby and all. Now, like, if you were a kid and you were listening to this for the first time, and you could like ask some questions about that text
Yeah.
to your mother,
Right.
what would you ask her?
Right, like, wait, first of all, why is it in the treetop? And second of all, am I going to fall?
Right? It's like, who put the baby on that bough?
Yeah.
How far off the ground was that cradle? Did anyone call 911
Yeah.
afterwards?
Yeah, exactly.
Who thought this was a good idea?
Right.
And why are you singing the song to me, Mom?
Right. Yeah.
Right? Are you planning to put the cradle
Right.
on that bough? It's a terrifying thing, and yet we get our kids to sleep by listening to this. So basically, if you let go of your preconceived notions of a text, if you just sort of pretend, I've never heard this before, I'm not going to be lulled to sleep by it. I'm going to approach this text as if for the first time, what do I then see in it? Suddenly you can begin to see some questions which had been hiding from you. And those questions are often windows into the deeper levels of understanding what's going on.
Beautiful. I have so many questions, but I would be sad if I don't get us to the Megillah. So why don't we put this theory to work with the Megillah? I'm going to pretend I know nothing about the Megillah, and I'll try to put away my preconceived notions a little bit here. What is the story that we are commanded to read on Purim every year, and what bring us in?
Yeah. So I guess one of the interesting questions about the Megillah is, and this is almost a critique that was leveled against this book. I remember, this book is a popular book. A lot of people like it, but I remember getting a letter from someone who was very unhappy with the book. And he said, this is a terrible book. It shouldn't be sold anywhere. And he said, I want you to know that I've written a letter to one of the rabbis who gave an approbation to this book, asking them to withdraw their approbation for it. He was so upset with this book. What was he so upset about? He contacted Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb, the executive director of the OU, emeritus, and said, you can't approve of this book.
Sure.
And his problem was, he said, you've talked a lot about the strategy of Esther and Mordechai and all of that, but where is God in the book? And you aren't talking explicitly about God's role in the book. And Rabbi Weinreb, when he got this person's, protest, basically says your problem isn't with Fohrman's book. Your problem's with the Megillah itself, right? That's one of the strange things about the Megillah, which is that God is behind the scenes. But it's an interesting question. The sort of the thrust of his critique, which is like, okay, but why is this a book in the Bible? It's this story of political intrigue. It's really, it's a very interesting story. Is it Machiavellian? Is it that Esther and Mordechai were so clever that they somehow managed to pull a rabbit out of the hat and save the Jews from this cataclysmic sort of thing? Or what is it that we learn from it? And you mentioned a Musar lens, which you like to take on things. So from that sort of ethical perspective, morality perspective, what is it that we learn about being a good person from this book? And I think that's a really serious question to ask, because, the standard answer that a lot of people give is like, well, it's a story about God behind the scenes, and it gives you a model for what it looks like when God acts in history behind the scenes.
Which feels relevant as like the modern holiday, because like when you live in diaspora, God's not in your face all the time, and so this idea that God is behind the scenes is like what's supposed to inspire us, and that's why Purim's the story we're still going to read after when Mashiach comes, right?
Sure. And so, not to take away from any of all of that, but if you were to give me this really hard-nosed interview here, and you would put on your Musar hat, you would say, Fohrman, that's all very nice, but what you're telling me is that the Megillah is a theological book, but you still haven't told me why it's telling me what I, as a human being, need to do in my life. So why is it a book for humans? It should be a book for God. It's like a manual. If you want to be God, here's how you should interact with the world.
Here's how to be behind
but
the
that's
scenes.
not what the Torah is. The Torah is addressed to human beings. And it's really true if you think about it. Like, let's say somebody said to you, Justin, you're a student of the Bible. Tell me, what does God do all day? Like, how does God spend his time? Like, I'm going to go up to first class, get myself a gin. I'll be right back. And tell me your answers. Like, there's no answer to that. Like, you read thousands of pages of Bible, and you realize, I feel like an idiot. I have no idea what God does all day. Because it's not a theological book. It's a book addressed to human beings about how they can be godly. What does it mean for me to bring godliness into my life? It's not about what it means for me to be God. When I get after I die and I get up to God so I can ask God those questions. But here I'm in this world. What is this book telling me about what it means to be a human in relationship with God in this world?
So that's a bit of your thesis of what all of Tanach is about.
Yes.
The biblical canon is the idea that it's telling us, it's showing us or paving a way for us for how to be godly.
It's right. There's very little about what it's like to be God, and a lot about what it's like to be godly. Even going back to, you opened with that idea about Shabbos that it sort of inspired you. It's interesting that Shabbos is actually one of those almost exceptions to the rule. If I would think about the entire 5 books of Moses, the moment would you actually get a picture of what it's like to be God as God, not God in relationship with human beings, but God as God, is actually the moment in creation that he finishes making stuff. And it says, "Vayivarech Elokim et yom hashvi'i vayikadesh oto, ki vo shavat Hashem mikom lachto." God blessed the Sabbath day, and he made it holy, because on it he rested. And you have this sense of God just like being really happy with this day, and thinking this day is really amazing. And if you think about it, he didn't advertise the day to anybody at that point. He didn't even tell Adam and Eve about the day. So there's no human being who knows about this. The Torah is telling you about God in his numinous solitude, what it's like to be God at that moment. And that's an exception. But even that, as you suggested, is an exception that in its own kind of way is meant to be a model for human beings. Because God was happy with this day because he was able to sit back and be in relationship with everything that he had just created, including these humans who he had just created on the 6th day. So in essence, he's modeling, right, in a way, you human beings, right, I just want you to know that I'm not actively trying to teach you what to do. I'm pulling back the window, showing you a little bit about what it's like to be me, a celestial being with kids, as it were. And maybe when you have kids, you can take that as a model, right? And that becomes your Shabbos many, many years later. But generally, that's what the Bible is. It's a manual for us how to be godly. So what does that mean in terms of the Megillah?
Great.
And I think that's a challenging question. So we put out a podcast, actually, Book Like No Other. Your viewers can take a look. It's on Apple Podcasts, and you can check it out. The season, which is rolling out now, is actually on the Megillah. So I'll give you a little taste of where we're going in that season. One of the methodological tools, you asked about the methodological tools I use. One of them is kind of getting past the lullaby effect and asking these sort of basic questions in the text. But another tool which I use a lot is actually a certain kind of rabbinic commentary. It's actually the oldest kind of rabbinic commentary that's around, and it's known as midrash. And midrashim are a very tricky kind of commentary to use, but they tend to be getting at deeper layers of meaning of the text. Almost as if there's this, a text can be read at a number of levels, kind of like layers of an onion. There's a simple level to read a text, and then there's deeper and deeper layers at which the text continues to make sense. And the midrash, in its oblique way, is kind of pointing you to these deeper layers.
And just a word on midrash or medrash, that the idea there is the rabbis in some ways it's kind of like fan fiction, for lack of a better term, but they're adding what's happening behind the scenes to this story to add more flavor, sometimes in like totally different ways, and sometimes some of our most famous midrashes, the idea that people think that they are part of the actual story, the idea that like Abraham, for example, Moses went to get the gold. Pharaoh, how do you say that in English? Pharaoh, thank you. Pharaoh offered gold and coals to Moses, and baby Moses took his hand, and an angel moved it onto the coals. He touched the coals, burnt his mouth. That's why he has a lisp, that whole thing. That's an example of something that's not in Torah. People might think it is, but it's actually a story. It's the fan fiction the rabbis added on, or maybe, according to others, is the oral tradition that was passed at Mount Sinai, where we actually know the other stories. Great. We have our background. Keep going.
Okay. So there's a couple of these midrashim, what they'll say things that seem on the face of it absurd. They almost seem like a Purim play. There's an entire tractate of the Talmud, tractate Megillah, which has a lot of these midrashim encoded within it. And I'll just throw one or two out to you, which I think are the beginning keys to kind of a deeper way of looking at things. There is this guy at the end of the Megillah by the name of Charvona. He's a minor character in the Megillah. He's the guy who, at the end of the Megillah, where Esther points at the banquet to Haman. And the king says, who is it that's threatening you and your people? She says, it's that guy. It's Haman, right? Right at that moment, what happens? The king is full of anger, and then he decides to take a walk in the garden.
Okay.
Right? Now, if you ask yourself, the one thing you know about Achashverosh is he's an impetuous guy, right? I mean, he just acts like this. He doesn't really think a lot, right? It's like Haman, like, let's kill all the Jews. It's like, sure. Yeah. And then come with me and let's go out to lunch afterwards, right? He doesn't really give things a moment's thought. All of a sudden, right, he finds out this guy who's threatening his queen. He's upset. Instead of doing what you would expect, which is off with his head, he's like, you know what, let me go out to the garden to cool down a little bit. That is bad news. If you're a Jew here, you do not want the king to think this over. You want him to act impetuously, but he does. He thinks it over, and he comes back, and then he sees Haman on the couch begging for his life to Esther. He comes to this conclusion that he's trying to seduce her, of all things, right? And says, what are you trying to seduce her? And you would again think it should be off with his head, but it's not. He has all these chances to just decree that it's going to be the end for Haman, but one after another, he's angry, but he just doesn't do it. And then Charvona shows up. And Charvona is this out of left field character who just one of the king's courtiers who pops in and says, by the way, just wanted to let you know, king, remember Mordechai? He was the guy who actually foiled the assassination plot, right? He was really on your team. Haman, it turns out, has this gallows in his backyard that he's been trying to hang Mordechai on. And the king is like, that's it, hang him on those gallows. So that's Charvona. That's all we really hear from Charvona and the whole Megillah. One of the strange things that the sages say is that Charvona was actually an angel. He was an angel. Strange, like, how do they know that was true? Why would they even think that's true? Are they serious that that's true, right? It's one of these strange midrashim, right? Where do they get this from? So that's kind of clue number one.
If I may, I'll insert there. A core thesis of mine is that we are all angels. I go to the story of Joseph, where he goes to find his brothers, and he's about to give up, and he runs into an ish basadeh, a man in the field, and the man in the field directs him to his brothers, and that leads to him becoming a slave and all those things.
There it is.
Right. And this idea that like all of us are sent at different moments to be messengers, and a malach is literally a messenger. An angel is a messenger of God. So in that respect, maybe that's literal, and maybe that's figurative and not literal, but to me, just one thought is that we are angels being sent on behalf of God, and that's why it means it's an angel there who's showing up in that moment to say to Achashverosh, here's the gallows.
Yeah, if you think about God's position in the Megillah, maybe the sages are getting something when they say, here's God, right? God is there with Charvona in a way, possibly. So that's medrash kind of number one. Here is comedy medrash number two. It literally could be part of a comedy skit. When the king goes for that walk, so it turns out that he comes back just as angry as he was before. Now, he went on the walk to cool down, so why isn't he cool? Like, he should have been relaxed. He saw the roses, right? Why isn't he upset? So the Talmud goes and says that he was just as angry when he came back as he was before, and here's why. And then it tells you this preposterous story. It says something happened on the walk.
Okay.
What happened on the walk?
Yeah.
He was out there in his Zen garden with all the cherry trees, right, just trying to calm down. But all of a sudden, there are these workers there, like with the yellow work tape, and jackhammers going off, and they're uprooting all of his trees in the garden. And he's like, what are you doing? You're taking apart my garden. I'm just trying to go for a stroll in the garden. And it's like, no, sorry, sire. Like, it's Tuesday afternoon. It's like you're trying to get somewhere in Manhattan, but 3 lanes are closed and there's 1 lane. It's like, really? You have to do this now? Like, that's the king. It's like, now, really? You've got to redo the whole garden. I said, nope. So the king's like, show me your work orders. It says, absolutely, sire. We got it right over here. He looks at the work orders, and who ordered this? Haman, right? So he's just as mad as before. Haman's uprooting all the trees in the garden. Like, why are you telling me that story? The Megillah was a perfectly fine book before you came along, rabbis. Why do you have to add that bit of fan fiction into this? It seems gratuitous. What are you trying to tell me with this, crazy story about the workers uprooting all the trees in the garden. The last of the three midrashim that I'd throw out to you is equally strange. The rabbis go and they say, they play a little sort of tongue-in-cheek game with us, the reader, and they say, the Megillah was written many centuries after the 5 books of Moses. But are there any hints in the 5 books of Moses to any of the characters in the Megillah? And the Talmud finds a hint, and it starts with Haman, right? And it says, Haman min Torah minayin. Where was Haman in the Torah? So, Justin, I'll give you a hint here, right? They find Haman in the Garden of Eden somewhere. So if you think about all the characters in the Garden of Eden, right? Adam, Eve, God, the snake, right? All these guys. And you had to say one of these guys is Haman, right? A hint to the Torah to Haman. Who would you associate most with Haman?
I'm guessing the snake.
You're guessing the snake.
Yes.
That's what I would guess too. The sages do indeed go back to the garden, but they don't equate Haman with the snake. They equate him with someone else. They say the hint to Haman in the Torah comes from the word Haman, in Hebrew spelled He Mem Nun. It turns out that those combination of letters, the first time they appear is in the garden. But in Hebrew, you have just consonants for letters. It depends how they're vowelized. So they weren't vowelized Haman, they were vowelized Hamin. There's this word, there's this phrase in the garden where right after Adam eats from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, God comes to him and he says, I'm naked, right? I'm embarrassed. I don't want to go walking in the garden with you. And God comes to him and says, one second, Hamin ha'etz asher tziviticha l'achol meno achalta? Do you mean to tell me that you really ate from that tree that I told you not to eat from? So the words for do you mean to tell me are Hamin, right? So literally what the sages are doing is taking the He Mem Nun in the garden and equating it to the He Mem Nun of the Megillah. Now, interestingly enough, the very first story in the biblical canon is the garden. The very last story in the biblical canon is actually the Megillah. And the sages are kind of bringing these two together and saying, if you want to understand Haman, you kind of have to go here. You have to look at the first story. You have to look at not the snake, you have to look at Adam having eaten from the tree. So, Justin, I would kind of put that out to you. It's like, what do the sages have up their sleeve there? And I think understanding that medrash is the key to understanding all the other ones, right? So let me ask you this. What is it, what would you really say is the commonality there between Adam having just eaten from the tree and Haman? Let's think about Adam for a moment. God is saying to him, did you really eat from that tree? Almost like incredulous, like I can't believe that you did that.
Right.
God's incredulity, I think, is coming from the fact that if you think about the command not to eat from the tree, it wasn't what you and I usually think it was. The command not to eat from the tree is the command that gets all the press. In truth, it was coupled with another command. What God said right before that was, Mikol eitz hagana achol tochel. You shall surely eat from all the trees of the garden.
Right.
And it says, and the trees are beautiful to look at, and they're delicious to eat. And God says, I want you to eat from all the trees of the garden. It's just this one tree, my tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that I don't want you to eat from.
Sure.
So there are all these trees in the garden. If you think about it, what did Adam and Eve do? There's no evidence that they ate from any of the other trees. They make a beeline for this tree that they're not supposed to eat from, leaving all these trees behind. And it's like none of them means anything to them. They have everything, essentially. But there's one thing they can't have. And the one thing they can't have is the one thing that obsessively occupies their mind, and they want that, and God's response to that is, are you crazy? Hamin ha'etz, you telling me that the one tree that you couldn't have, that's the only thing you cared for? That's the tree you ate from? Okay, now put like that, does that remind you of Haman at any moment in the Megillah, right? This guy who could have had anything, right? Who really should have everything, but it didn't matter to him, right?
So, I mean, first thing that comes to mind, I hope this isn't because I'm a grandchild of Holocaust survivors, is his obsession with wanting to either hurt Mordechai, or the Jewish people more broadly. He's like obsessed with Mordechai, it seems like, and trying to
Absolutely.
defeat him. Yeah.
And the moment that obsession comes through is literally where he has this conversation with his wife and with his kids. It's a crazy conversation. Let me read it to you.
Okay.
Right? So here's the background, right? Esther convenes this banquet, right? Now, really, she's getting ready to accuse Haman.
Mm-hmm.
She has these 2 banquets, and she's just had the first one.
Mm-hmm.
And in the first one, she's told the king, you know, king, I don't want to tell you what I want now, but tomorrow you and Haman come back, and I'll tell you what I want then. In between those 2 banquets, Haman has
By the way,
this...
as a side note, I never understood why she did that, by the way. But,
Right, it's a strange thing. So I talk about that a little bit in the book. It seems like Esther seems very, very nervous to go to the king.
Not ready to pull the trigger.
Feels like she's not ready to pull the trigger. Feels like if she... And the banquets, by the way, are very strategic. Think about it. If you're the king, that night, strangely, the king can't sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Why do you think he had insomnia that night? The queen comes to him and says, you know, I'd love it, king, if you would come to this banquet. Just you, me, and Haman. And then she says something very interesting. She says, could you please come to this banquet, asher asiti lo, that I have made for him?
Mm.
Who's him?
Mm.
Is the banquet for the king? Is the banquet for Haman? You're the king.
Right.
If the banquet's for the king, what are you thinking?
Right. Why is this guy here?
Why is this guy here?
Mm-hmm.
If the banquet's for Haman, what are you thinking?
Why are you making a banquet for Haman?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Either way,
Yeah.
right, you're mad.
You're stressed.
Right? You
Yeah.
understand now why you
Yeah.
didn't sleep that night.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
That's
It's like,
interesting.
what's going on with the queen?
Yeah.
And the next time, right, so it's like, and at that banquet, she says, you know, I'd really love you to come back tomorrow for the banquet that I'm going to make for both of you. So all of a sudden things are in motion, like
Okay.
it's changed, right? So she's playing with this notion of this. She seems to be intimating the possibility of some kind of involvement that she has with Haman, right? Leading to the king to accuse him of seducing his wife on the couch, like we said
Right.
before. It's like, where did he get that idea from?
She's right. She's planting the seeds of Achashverosh to look towards Haman with a suspicious eye.
Exactly,
Okay.
right? But Haman doesn't see any of that.
Okay.
And he is just absolutely riding high
Right.
that he has been selected to be the number 1 guy
Right.
who's going to these banquets
I got
with the
the
queen.
invite. I'm a big
I got
shot.
the invite.
Yeah.
I'm a big shot,
Yeah.
right? Like, and he posts it all over his social media, right? So here is Haman. Vayetze Haman bayama usameach v'tov lev. He leaves that banquet and he is happy as a lark. Uchiraot Haman at Mordechai, but then he sees Mordechai. Bashar Hamelech v'lo kam v'lo zavimenu. He sees Mordechai and Mordechai doesn't move. Mordechai doesn't bow before him. Vayimalei Haman al Mordechai chema. And he is filled with rage. But he holds himself back and he comes to his household and he calls all of his buddies and his wife Zeresh. And he starts talking to them. Vayisaper le'em Haman at Kvod Oshro, and Haman starts telling them about how rich he is. V'rov banav, and how many children he has. Now imagine, you're his wife, do you understand? And he's telling you about his bank account and how rich he is, and about how many children he has, as if she doesn't know. It's just this very pitiable display where he's like saying, like, look, I have everything, but kol asher gidlo hamelech, and all of the fame and fortune that the king has given him, the station that he has in the palace, that asher niso al asarim, and how he's above all the other officers of the king. Vayomer Haman, and then Haman says, Af lo hevia Esther amalka imamelech al mishteh asher asasa kimoti. And the cherry on top of all of this is I just now came from a banquet and no one was invited to that banquet except for me. That's how high I am in this society. And then he says the following thing, and you kind of have to feel sorry for him. V'chol zeh einenu shaveli. But none of this means anything to me. B'chol et asher ani ro'et Mordechai Yehudi yoshev b'shar melech. Every time I see Mordechai not standing up, just sitting there in the gates, right? Every time I see that, none of this means anything to me. And now you understand, right? This is Adam. Wow. This is Adam eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? It's crazy. He had everything. but there's one thing he can't have. And the one thing he can't have is like this obsession, right? So the sages are actually connecting these two events across time and saying, if you want to understand Haman, you've got to understand Adam. And in a way, if you want to understand Adam, you've got to understand Haman. These characters are two sides of the same coin, which is really remarkable. And I think one of the, you asked about methodology before, like the tools that I use. One of the tools I use, and it's really not me, it's the midrash. You see what the midrash is doing, is a very, very powerful tool called intertextuality, which is the Torah will often comment on itself, and will comment on itself by stringing together or by piecing together two different narratives and saying, if you really want to understand this narrative, this other narrative is a lens through which to view it. And this narrative is a lens through which to view that. Either narrative can be seen as a lens through which to view the other, almost as if the Bible is a self-commenting work, that it can illuminate itself. So if we just kind of take a deep breath and say, all right, what are the implications of this? What emerges from this? Let's say it's really true that Haman is a reflection of Adam at this moment. What does that tell you? So let me ask you this. Why would it be that, if you think about that moment in the Garden of Eden, that God puts that tree off limits, right? And says, don't eat from that tree. One of the most basic questions you can ask about the story of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is why God did that. I wrote a book about this story, and I did not address this question in the book. And the reason I didn't address this question of like why God would put a tree in the garden if he really didn't want anyone to eat from it, it seems like such a waste of a tree, right? Is like a really good question. Honestly, the reason I didn't address it is because I didn't have an answer for it. It's just a strange question, like what's the answer to that? Why say you can have all of these trees, but there's one tree that you can't have, right? So I think there's something really profound about that. If you think about all these trees that he can have, that are described as so delicious to eat, so beautiful to look at, it's almost like those trees are gifts, right? Like there's these beautiful gifts that God is giving to Adam in the garden. God is giving to Adam and Eve. So imagine for a moment, put yourself in the shoes of someone bestowing gifts. Here you are, Justin, it's a few years' time, right from now, you have grandchildren, right? And your grandchild, Bobby, is 6 years old. Okay. And here you are, Grandpa, and you're going to visit Bobby in Canada, where his parents live, and you come bearing gifts. Okay. You have this big 500-piece Lego battleship, right? And you're giving it to Bobby. What would you want? You then give it to Bobby. Bobby has this big smile. What do you want to happen next? Bobby has just received his battleship. What would you like to see happen?
I'd love to see Bobby say thank you and then hopefully use the battleship, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. Two things, right? And what if I interviewed you, Justin, and I said, oh, you're supposed to be interviewing me, but if I interviewed you and I said, Justin, let me ask you something. Why? I understand why you want Bobby to, have fun with the battleship. I mean, that's why you bought it. You enjoy him having fun with his gifts. But what if I tried to browbeat you and make you feel guilty and say, Justin, like, why do you really need Bobby to say thank you? It's like, really, you're such an egotist. You need your ego stroked like this from 5-year-old Bobby. So let's say he doesn't say thank you, right? Let's say he just plays with this battleship. Why isn't that good enough? How come you have to have this gratitude from 5-year-old Bobby? What would you tell me? Would you back off and say, no, you're right, really, I feel very guilty about that, right? Or would you defend your position at all?
I would defend my position and say that the gratitude is not about my gratification, it's about him developing a sense of gratitude when he receives things.
Yes. And to some extent, it's not just a sense of gratitude when he receives things in the abstract.
Oh, good.
But it's also a relationship with you. In other words, it's not so much that you're egotistical, right? It's not that you need his things. All you want is that when Bobby plays with this battleship, he should understand there was a gift from you, right? Because what if Bobby never gives you a sideways look for the 2 weeks that you're there, plays with his battleship, does his whole thing, but kind of ignores you? What's happening is he's almost succumbing to this illusion my room came with Lego battleships. You know what I mean? But that's not the truth, right? Grandpa gave this to them. So you are offering a gift of love. You want it to be understood as a gift of love, an acknowledgement as a way that Bobby can understand this, and that strengthens your relationship. And if anything, makes the battleship more wonderful and delicious to him, because it's not just a battleship, it's a battleship that my grandpa gave me because he loves me. Then it's like a really wonderful thing to play with.
Right.
God crafted an amazing experience in the Garden of Eden. He didn't require us to say thank you. Instead of saying thank you, all you had to do was this: enjoy all of these trees. There's one tree that's my tree, that's Grandpa's special tree. It's a tree of knowledge, good and evil. Stay away from that one tree. By doing so, what do? You stay in a sense of consciousness that I'm a guest in the garden, and that I'm being given all these gifts in the garden because there's a master in the garden. I can't touch him. I can't feel him. I can fool myself into thinking he's not there. I can fool myself into thinking my room came with all of these trees, right? But that's not the case.
Beautiful.
There's somebody there who loves me enough, who cared to not just give me a bunch of calories that don't taste like anything, but kiwis and cherries and all these incredibly delicious fruits, right? Because he loves me. So it's this way of cultivating love. But if that's true, then why can't Adam do that? Why would he want that one tree? So let me ask you, Justin, if you're Adam, what's the other side of the equation? Why would you say, no, I think I really want that one tree, that tree of knowledge, good and evil. I think I want that. Why not? Why can't you just abide by this one restriction? It seems like the easiest thing to do. Right. What's the temptation?
So what comes to mind for me are two things. One is sometimes we just want what's forbidden to us. If I can't have it, I want to know why, and I want to have that thing. And the second is, given the name of the tree and the fact that it's forbidden, maybe there's something actually special about that particular tree that I have some sense of jealousy or interest or something to get at.
It's a tree of knowledge of good and evil of all things, right? What greater power is there in the world than to be able to declare that this is good and this is bad, and I'm the one who can make those decisions, right? The sense that I am a guest in the garden, that there's someone with more power than me, right? It sort of ignites this sense that, one second, I'm not sure if I like all these rules. Maybe those rules are there for a good reason, but what if I were the rule maker? Maybe I could have that ability too. There's this sense that I'm not sure I want to be a guest in the garden. What would it be like to be the master, to have the ultimate control, to be able to even declare what's good and what's bad, to be able to make the rules of the game, right? That seems to be the temptation, to pretend that you are God, to pretend that you are the king. Why is it that Haman so desperately, right? Adam perhaps wants to pretend that he's God. Haman, maybe, wants to pretend that he's the king. He wants everyone to bow to him, but there's one guy that doesn't bow. Every time that one guy doesn't bow, it's this consciousness that I guess I'm not the king. But if everyone bowed before me, right? If I had the ultimate power, right? Then what? And so Haman comes and says, I don't know, I think I need it all. And then all of a sudden, he talks to who, of all people? Zeresh, his wife. Now, if I put you in Zeresh's shoes, what should Zeresh say? Here he's laid out his heart, right? What would you say, Zeresh? I feel terrible. I have everything. Just this one thing I don't have.
Sweetheart, we're so blessed. Let it go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's this moment where you have to ask yourself, what does it mean to be a good wife? I could just say, you know what? If my husband wants something, I should try to facilitate that for him. Or maybe what he wants isn't so good for him. At which point I can say, like, look, we're so blessed. I think you can let it go. I'm so proud of you, just the way you are. The gift of love for you as just one human being to another, I don't need you to be the king, right? Is very, very calming. But it's not what Zeresh does. Zeresh says, make a gallows, make a tree, and hang him on the gallows, right? Now ask yourself, if Haman is playing Adam,
Yeah.
and you can have everything, right? And the king, right? There's the king and there's God, right? The king is playing God. Who is Zeresh playing back in the story of the tree of knowledge of good and evil?
Chava, Eve.
She's playing Eve.
Yeah.
It's the giving of the forbidden fruit. Mordechai is the forbidden fruit. And the question is, what does it mean to be a good wife? By giving the forbidden fruit to Adam, Eve is basically saying, I know you're attracted to me, but I think I'd be attracted to you a little bit more if you were superhuman, if you were a little bit more like God. Or she can say, you know, I love you for your humanity. I love you just for who you are. And with that, he can say is, I don't need to be God.
Wow.
I have the love of another human being. And Zeresh is teaching you what it means to be a good wife through her example of folly, of feeding literally the forbidden fruit. And think about forbidden fruit. Where does fruit hang? Who's the forbidden fruit? The forbidden fruit is the one thing you can't have. It's Mordechai. Where does forbidden fruit hang? On a tree.
Yeah.
And she says, why don't you just make a tree? And that fruit will just be dangling there. You could just have that fruit, right? And she hands it to him. And the very next story, and with this I'll close, the very next story is, she says, you know, go to the king and just ask for permission to hang Mordechai. And the next thing he does is he goes to the king and he's transparently interested in the king's crown. And it's like the king says, 1 second, before we even talk about what you want to talk about, what should we do with the king, the guy the king wants to honor? And Haman is like, that's me. And he has this vision of himself as king with all the king's robe and all the king's crown. And the king looks at that and it's like, he wants my throne. But it's like when you want the forbidden fruit, when you must have it, what are you really saying? You're saying, I want to be the king. So here's the sages kind of giving you a view into the story. If for folks who listen to Book Like No Other and are interested in those other two midrashim, right, that notion of Charvona as an angel, the other angels digging up the trees, where those fit into the picture is that if you continue playing this game that the sages have started you on, which is 1 second, Garden of Eden at the beginning of the Torah, another tree of knowledge at the end of the Torah, and the story of the Megillah, the characters match up. It's Adam, it's Haman, it's Zeresh, it's Chava, it's the king, it's God. As you begin to fill in the cast of characters, there's other characters too. Charvona, who is Charvona playing back in the garden, right? Who are these workmen angels playing back in the garden? As you continue to see the picture emerge, right? That one clue the sages give you, Haman is playing Adam, right? Is like the beginning of a set of dominoes that help you see the larger picture of how these stories come together, which I think is what the sages were getting at in those midrashim.
Wow. Mind blown. This was amazing. I have a million questions which I'll ask you after we stop, viewers. I'm sorry they're going to miss it. But check out a book like no other. Look at alephbeta.org. You can pick up all these pieces. I just want to say thank you so much, Rabbi Fohrman. Really, this has been an amazing opportunity, and I've learned so much in such a short amount of time. Thank you so much.
Okay, Justin, that's great. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Happy Purim, everyone.